Cool. Yeah, Christie lovely to see a fantastic turnout this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming along. Greatly enjoyed the last one of these talks that I came to from Dr. Inaugural ahead of Oban, the anniversary of Oban's 300th birthday in March. That was great fun. So it's lovely to see so much Gaelic-based events within the society. So, yeah, picking up on what Jill said so far about Late Brigadier John MacFarlane, it's an honour to be invited to talk at the inaugural memorial lecture for the late Brigadier. I only had the pleasure of meeting the Brigadier once. I know there are so many folk in this room that would have known the man himself so much better than I did, but I'm sure you can all testify that one meeting is more than a lifetime of meeting many other people. When I met him at Mod Glasgow 2019, I think the choir were about to go on stage, and I nabbed him, and I happened to mention that I was from Loch side, and that was us there for 45 minutes or so, missing a slot with the choir. But it was absolutely lovely, and just the amount of information I picked up from the man was absolutely amazing. And people like the late Brigadier and people in that world are essentially the reason that I've been so passionate and so into learning about this idea of place names and the people, place, and the language. The name I've given to this talk is Chi in Canon Snydania, which plenty of folk in here will know was the slogan of the Highland Land League, but it also really accurately describes the inherent Gaelic cultural connection between the people, the place, and the land. When it comes to interpreting history, particularly in this part of the world, I think that's a really important concept to understand, because knowing about each of these begins to inform, and you get this exponential growth of knowledge about each and every one of these aspects. So that's hopefully what we're going to pick up on today. So as Jill kindly said, we're looking not only to the past here, with looking at Gaelic place names and the history of it, and the amazing work collated by John MacFarlane and his peers, but also looking to the future. So when I was invited to do this talk today, I decided that rather than just reeling off a series of place names, which is one of my favourite pastimes, which my girlfriend and friends do not so much enjoy, I decided I should probably try and make it a little bit more palatable than that. So what we're looking at today is essentially going to try and equip yourselves with the ability to go into this topic yourselves and begin to kind of realise that it is not something that comes only with entire fluency in the Gaelic language and entire years and years and years of scholarship and research. It's actually very tangible with a few basic concepts and basic bits of knowledge. So that's what we're going to begin to look at before looking at some interesting examples, a little bit of grammar, which I will do as quick as I possibly can for those that don't enjoy grammar, and then also opening up to yourselves. I really want to get through this relatively quickly so that we can open it up and we can actually have a big conversation amongst ourselves about place names, but local area relating to Gaelic. And as I say, this exponential circle of knowledge, that will be replicated hopefully in the room, and as we begin to talk about names, everyone will begin to go, yeah, what about this? Yeah, what about this? And it goes round and round and round. So that's my plan for this afternoon, if that's okay. But without further ado, I will get on with the beginning of the talk. So sorry, I should have shown this. So this is an example of actually some of the work that the late Brigadier John MacFarlane has done with society previously. And there is an absolute wealth of research which various people in the room have access to and have looked at before, that I will reference at the end of this as well, and I would highly recommend everyone looking at this. But what I'm aiming for is to begin to equip you with the skills to go into this kind of knowledge, this kind of research at an even deeper level. So, history, that's what we're all here for today. This presentation initially established for a lot of schools, a lot of high schools and primary schools that aren't so familiar with history. I know that 95% of people in this room are going to know this like the back of their hand, so don't let me teach you to suck eggs. But we're going to go back 2,000 years, roughly, to the year 0 AD, and we have these people called the Celts. So the Celts we're all familiar with. A lot of historians like to describe them as being mystical and what have you. We actually know a lot about them, a lot more than a lot of other peoples in that area of Indo-Europe and Europe. But the Celts were a people that came from, as I say, Indo-Europe, Eurasia, good few thousand years ago. They move across all of Europe. They're given different names by Romans, by different empires. They end up settling in the western fringes, so they settle in the Iberian Peninsula for a while, and they eventually get moved on, and they finally settle in the very far western fringes of Europe, which is what we now know as the British Isles, and also parts of France here, Brittany, as we can see. These are what, today, in 2024, we call the Celtic nations. They didn't look like this 2,000 years ago, but this gives you a little rough aspect of where the Celts are and where they've come from. So we have these two language branches, which I won't talk about too much, but these were Celtic languages that split at one point, P-Celtic and Q-Celtic. We're going to be mostly looking at the Q-Celtic areas because, as you can see, that covers what is now known as Scotland, Ireland and the Isle of Man right in the middle there. Moving on from 0 AD, we get into the meaty stuff, 500 to 1000 AD. As I've said here, during the first millennium, it's all a bit of a boodle. And we can see that from all these blobs on the map here. When we are watching the weather, watching Reporting Scotland in the evening, we have usually big blobs of low pressure coming in over Scotland off the Atlantic. We call these isobars. In linguistics, we have an equivalent concept called isoglosses. Feel free to come in and have a seat at the front here if you'd like. We have isoglosses. Gloss, Latin for tongue. So isogloss is kind of the blob where a language is spoken. There's a seat here towards the back and also a seat at the front if you'd like.
Okay.
There you go. So the isoglosses we're looking at here, in the northwest of Scotland and the Northern Isles, we have Scandi settlement. So this means that these were Scandinavian languages, or a Scandinavian language that was being spoken in this area due to the Viking conquest, Viking raids from 700 AD onwards. They are the predominant language in the north-west of Scotland and the Western Isles. To the northeast of Scotland, Grampian area, up towards Aberdeen, we have Pictish brackets question mark, which isn't very useful because it contributes to this idea that, again, Picts and these people that are in Scotland were a bit mysterious. They weren't particularly mysterious. What is mysterious is what exactly their language looked or sounded like, because they did not have a written language structure that we recognise. They used pictorial carvings, hence Picts, we believe, not because they drew on themselves. That's always their myth. So we have Picts up here, around the same time. Below them we have the Brythonic people, the Britons. If anyone remembers Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Arthur is the king of the Britons, that's who these people are. So these are essentially a P-Celtic people in the south part of Scotland. And then below that, at the same time, we have Scandi settlement, so Danes, and the Dane law, which was the name given to lots of parts of northern England. So more Vikings, but coming in from the east this time. The biggest isogloss I've got here are what I've described as the Gaelic peoples, the Gael. So we have that stretching from Northern Ireland and into Archaeological and up the western seaboard itself. So it's generally said that the Gaelic settlement of Argyll of Scotland happened at around 500 AD with this big massive movement of people from Northern Ireland under a gentleman called Fergus Mór Mac Eric. That's found not necessarily to be true, it's a bit of a later myth, that in fact with the case being that there's 12 miles over the Moyle Strait between Antrim and the Mull of Kintyre, it's very likely, and the archaeological evidence suggests, well, does tell us, that in fact there was settlement and there was exchange and change of movement between Northern Ireland and Argyll for at least 1,000 years before that. So Gaelic has been the language of, in this case, of Northern Ireland, of Ireland, and of the western seaboard for around about 1,000 to 1,500 years already when we're looking at 500. It's just that at that point things begin. In the early years, things begin to become really, really Gaelicized. By the beginning of the second millennium, as I say, the Picts and Britons aren't really in the picture anymore due to lots of confusing to people like me who just look at linguistics rather than archaeology. Lots of people in this room probably know why. The Picts and Britons aren't really in the picture anymore, but Gaels and Norse settlers are the commanding forces in the northern half of the British Isles at this point. After 1,000 though, we're seeing new isoglosses. So the big red one that we're seeing here is the English language and Germanic languages such as Norman, Danish, Saxon, and the emergence of Scots as its own independent language. This comes around from about 1100 AD onwards due to Scottish King Davy, King David, marrying an English Queen, Margaret, I believe, who brought in essentially the first Anglo-Saxon bureaucracies and systems of commerce into Scotland, bringing it up the east coast from the south. So that's at that point we then get these market towns, these royal boroughs being established. If you wanted to make money in the northern half of the British Isles, English was the language you needed to use. So 1100 marked this high point for the Gaelic language in Scotland. What I haven't shown here, this isogloss, it doesn't work exactly like that. The isogloss of this room changed around about 1:30, and then it changed about 1:45, and it changed about 2 again, depending on the different people that are walking and speaking different languages. So they don't have these hard borders. The isogloss of Gaelic essentially at one point did cover the entirety of Scotland, which we're going to discover through place names. But here, this is where it's most powerful, this green blob. So yeah, 1100 is the high point. On the west coast, however, what's happening, they still consider it a bit of a high point for Gaelic kingdoms, because we have the establishment in around about 900 AD of the Lordship of the Isles, which was this independent Gaelic and Norse kingdom Gaelic and Norse kingdom that essentially ran the entire western seaboard and the islands on the west coast. So although that's the high point, it still is a really significant high point for Gaelic and Norse. When we're talking about this relationship between Scotland and Ireland, this useful map produced by, I can't remember what the project was, maybe about 20 years ago, Chead Callanhilia, Columba's Land. It kind of puts the British Isles as we see them a little bit on slant to show the connection between place names. Now, I can't actually zoom in and show you, but anyone that's spent a bit of time in Ireland or Scotland, you will be doing the exact same thing I do if you look at the signs long enough, which is, yeah, that means that. Same thing will happen as well if you spent any time in the Western Isles and go over to Scandinavia, see the exact same thing due to the Norse influence. But in Ireland and Scotland, we have these shared cultures, shared mythologies, shared pre-Christian and shared Christian beliefs that are demonstrated through the place names. So there is this shared culture going on from about 500 AD up to the modern day, essentially, but of course political change over these hundreds and hundreds of years impacts how that is demonstrated. So it said at the bottom here, Gaelic language suffers through economic pressures, legal statutes and active persecution from 1100 to the present day, which is very true. Gaelic is a minority language spoken by a minoritized people in Scotland. But despite this, despite the language only being spoken by 1% of people today in Scotland, it has left an indelible mark on the country's landscape, which is place names. So we're going to look at place names from across the country, and hopefully I'll get some more from yourselves as well. If you look hard enough, anywhere on mainland Scotland and the Western Isles, you will find some evidence of Gaelic settlement through the place names. That's my guarantee. The only place you won't really find it, as far as I know, is in Shetland. You'll find bits of it in Orkney, but there wasn't huge amounts of Gaelic settlement in Orkney at all. So the place names are our biggest indicator of how significant the Gaelic language was at one point. So yeah, going back to this concept of isoglosses. Anyone been here before? I'm sure a few folk have. Yeah, I haven't. I would like to go for a swim. It's in Mull, I think it's near Tobermory, but this is the S4's waterfall. Now S4's waterfall is a tautology, which means it says the same thing over and over and over. So we've got 3 different languages at play here. Ace, the modern day Gaelic word for a waterfall. Force, coming from the Norse for the waterfall. We see that in Scandinavia, foss today, and in Perthshire there's a foss. And then waterfall, English for a waterfall. So this is waterfall, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's really demonstrative of what humans like to do. I'm sure there's examples of some of us that might have moved house, and we have fond memories of our previous house. So we moved to a new village, we put the new name of the house. We decide that's what it's called. Whatever, we moved to somewhere in southern England, and you decide to name your house Kilnamara, just to remind you of where you're from. People have been doing that for centuries. That's how we mark our territory. So S4's waterfall is a great example of how different linguistic peoples have done that in Scotland. So yeah, waterfall, waterfall, waterfall. Has anyone seen Brave? I'm sure you've seen Brave. Yeah. What's the castle called in Brave? Can anyone remember? It's a trivia point for today. It's Castle Dunbroch, which is also a tautology in 3 different languages. Castle, castle, castle. Broch, we think. Castle Dunbroch. So, we're going to move on to trying to hopefully equip yourselves with a little bit of know-how to turn this map into this map here. A lot of us might be familiar with looking at this map in Cruachan, whether we've gone walking or what have you, but you might not have considered that all those little scribblings on the OS map actually do have real meaning to them here. I mean, just looking at Cruachan here, this already tells you it's got a rich agricultural, a rich kind of heritage of husbandry and what have you, and just knowing this landscape in and out. So that's hopefully what we're going to try and equip you to do with a few tools. So this is the interactive part. Get ready to sound silly. So we've got about, I think, 20 words or so that are really, really common in the Scottish landscape, the Gaelic landscape, that we will have probably come across, a lot of us be familiar with, but we might not be familiar with sounding it out if we're not familiar with Gaelic. So if you feel confident, we're going to try and learn how to say them together. Don't have to join in if you don't want to. As I say, this presentation was first made for primary schools. So yeah, the first word we have is a bine, a mountain or a hill. Bine, try that. Bine. So we know it is anglicised as Ben quite often. Ben Cruachan, Ben Louis, Ben Nevis. More often it's the more popular hills, the more notable hills that are changed to Ben. Those that don't get climbed that much or aren't the focus of mountaineers or climbers or tourists or whatever it is, they remain as bine. So that's a great example of an isogloss changing. And a good example of that in a village name is Gairloch Head. So Gairloch Head, Gair means short, loch is a loch, a lake, and head means it's at the top of it. There's another Gairloch Head on Loch Linney, the estate Kin Gairloch. Means the same thing, kin is head. So Kin Gairloch is just a little bit more Gaelic than Gairloch Head. So a little bit further north, a little bit further west. And that's due to this English isogloss that didn't quite have as much impact. So it's the same word. So we see that with bine. Where the English language has permeated more, we see it as ben. So bine, a mountain or a hill. Meow, I haven't put my definition there, apologies. A meow, let's all say meow. Meow. Yeah, it sounds silly now. Meow. So meow is a lump, which we have a lot of in Argyll, as I'm sure you can imagine. There's lots of roads called meow, particularly over Perthshire and the Central Highlands, because they are lumps. And as you see here, I've got a little picture of a lump. So meow, this is meow or down towards Lochavi. Meow. Great. Cairn. A rocky hill. So this is where we get the English word cairn from. It's gone all around the world. There's a big city in Australia, cairns, and everyone, when you go trek Everest Base Camp, you go past lots of cairns to tell you where you're going. There will be undoubtedly indigenous words for these, but the English language impact has gone so wide that we call them all cairns. So a cairn refers to a rocky hill. So a hill that you're not going to see the mat grass or the bedrock through, it's just going to be a kind of pile of boulders. So as great as the OS is, the Ordnance Survey maps are for navigators and mountaineers, having a little bit of Gaelic tells you exactly what that summit is going to look like. So Cairn Dúchara here, above Ballinanule, south of Oban, this has this lovely rocky summit that we don't know from the map, but we do know from the Gaelic name. Bialach. Yeah, we all know this as Bealach from Bealach and Ree. So that's the big hill that we always get stuck in summer coming down into town. So Bealach and Ree is Bialach in Ree. Bialach, a pass, a mountain pass, in Ree of the king or of the slope. We're not too sure whether it's king or slope. But hence why we have this, the king's knoll. It's been translated as knoll in that name there. But Bialach is a pass, a low point between two hills. It's the same derivation for Balach in down at the bottom of Loch Lomond. That's traditionally the pass from highlands into lowlands. And it also does have hills on either side. So Balach comes from Bialach. Curra. A glacial bowl is what I've said here. Often anglicised to corrie, like the corries. So a corrie is essentially this scoop that's been scooped out of a mountainside by the movement of a glacier. Quite often there'll be a lochan at the bottom. Sometimes there won't be, sometimes it's just a bit, they're totally dry, like this one here, Curra Caderly. So Curra is a glacial bowl. But it's, there's probably about 10,000 curras on the OS map of Scotland, really common mountain feature. But Corra has now evolved to be the modern day Gaelic word that we use for a kettle. So if I ask someone to stick the kettle on, Corra, that's what I'll say. Because the intermediary word we have there is cauldron. So a Corra is a bowl that can contain water. So then when we were naming a cauldron as Gaelic speakers hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we came up with Corra, and that's translated to modern day. What you use to boil water in, you use a kettle. So it's quite interesting how an ancient word has now got a brand new meaning in modern day Gaelic. Corra, a kettle. Excuse me, the glacial bowl, also a kettle. Alt. Yeah, I struggle to get this name across when I'm doing this in online sessions because it's a bit weird, but alt. So it's got this big thick L where the back of your tongue is hitting the top of your palate. Everyone's going to make it weird. But alt. It's a thick Gaelic L. Yeah. Just means a stream. I mean, we see this everywhere, a stream or a burn. And again, burn is a great example, particularly in Loch Lomond, around about that area, where we would expect to see alt, we see burn. And that's because of this English isogloss that's been pushing up from the central belt, and everywhere we see alt, we see burn. But the joke is on Scots because the word burn originally comes from Gaelic búr, which means drinking water. So it all goes back to Gaelic. I'm sure you get it's going to be my message. Alt, a stream. Cailleach. Old woman. So it's not a derogatory term in any way. Cailleach, it can be used to refer to a mother, an older person in a family, an auntie, a granny, whatever it is. But most commonly in Gaelic landscape, we know it as referring to the pre-Christian female goddess, the Cailleach. So one of the belief systems of pre-Christian Celtic Scotland and Ireland was that there was a system of two deities. There was the Cailleach and the Botoch, the old woman and the old man. And the Cailleach was responsible for, and again I think I'm preaching to the choir, a lot of folk, if you've looked at history around this area, you'll be familiar with the Cailleach. But the Cailleach was responsible for storms and weather and winter. These are the things she's known for today. In reality, she's responsible for, also responsible for fertility, agriculture, the success of things like that. The Botoch, on the other hand, the man, was responsible for systems, law and order, society, and organisation. Which, looking back, seems like it may be a slightly misogynistic view of this two-deity system. But in reality, the message at the heart of it was that no matter what the man, the Botoch, arranges, puts in place, the Cailleach has the power to completely wipe it out. But it all goes back to this idea of nature trumps all, which is very pertinent today. But this kind of system of two gods, or at least a female goddess, was very, very prominent in so many pagan or pre-Christian peoples around about Europe. This is really, really common, the idea of worshipping the Cailleach, the old woman. So the reason I've got Connell Bridge here, Falls of Laura is an Oceanic era name, so people might be familiar with the Oceanic tales. I'm not hugely familiar with it, but I do know that next year's speaker is, won't give it away. So you can ask him then, or her then. But the Falls of Laura is an Oceanic name, so that's a modern, fairly modern name, past 200, 300 years. Before then, they were known as Clacharan na Cailliche. Clacharan, stepping stones, na Cailliche, of the old woman. So it said the old woman would walk across Loch Etive using the Falls of Laura as stepping stones. There you go. Right, going back to the slightly easier things. Anyone that's been on Duolingo for even half a day will have come across the word bake. Bake. It's something small. Usually accompanies something big beside it, so that you have the relative difference. So we've got two glens here on Kerala. Glaun Mór, Glaun Big. Mór, of course, big, which I think is my next one here. Yeah. Mór. Glaun Mór, Glaun Big. See the same in the two herdsmen of Etive, the shepherds of the Etive, like in the hymn, are the Buchalie Eche Mór, Buchalie Eche Big. So the Buchal Etive Mór, Buchal Etive Big. So there's the big shepherd, the big herdsman, and the small herdsman. Any fisher folk in here? Anyone go fishing? Yeah. What fish is this? Whoever's hand that is. There you go. I hope it's a trout because I googled trout to get it. If it's a salmon, my entire slide here is ruined. So I hope it's not. No, I believe it's a trout. So the Gaelic word we have for a trout is a brech, which means speckled or freckled, which obviously a trout is renowned for. I don't fish, if you can't tell. But brech is a really common word because this kind of speckly patchwork colour, if you look anywhere in the Scottish uplands, this is the kind of pattern you will see. So Bainvrich here above Glensalloch out on the Benor Road, Bainvrich, the speckled, the patchwork kind of hill. So this is really, really common. It's kind of a Gaelic get out of jail free card. If you can't think of what a hill's called, just say, Bainvrich, because look, it's got lots of colours on it. It's got this kind of patchwork colour. And we can also call tartan, it's described as brech in a lot of the traditional poetry. They say you're wearing your brech, your breaker. So it's this kind of speckled patchwork colour. Arshed. Arshed. A few ways to say this, that's how we'd say it around here, I believe. I'm not an expert in Argyll dialect, but arshed, or art, if you're from potentially the Western Isles. So arshed is a promontory, something that sticks out into the land. Here we've got a map of Ardúine, down south of Oban. So you can see where that Ard is coming in from, Ardúine. So it's this promontory that sticks out into the sea. And arshed Oine means green. So we can see from there where the gardens are, there is this lovely green promontory. So with these basic little bits of vocabulary and some of the skills I'm going to show you in a minute, you can begin to work out why places are called what they are. So arshed Oine, the green promontory. I won't go through all of these. I'd recommend, if folk are interested in reading a little bit more about this, reading the paper Window to the West by Professor Meg Bateman and Dr. John Purser, who are two fantastic Gaelic scholars. They have written a lot about the traditional Gaelic perspective on the world, the Gaelic worldview. And a big part of that is the colour spectrum. So a lot of different indigenous cultures use a different colour spectrum to what we use in English, which is this idea of the primary colours, secondary colours, tertiary colours. And an example of that is this one here, goron, blue or green. So Gaelic speakers in the room will know that as soon as you say goron, meaning blue, it feels a little bit uncomfortable because it doesn't. We describe grass that's growing really, really healthily as looking goron, healthy and fertile. So Isla in Gaelic, its Bardic name is Ile Goron Yor, blue Isla, Isla of the blue grass. So it doesn't make sense to us translated into English. You can't really translate it. It is this luscious verdant, although verdant means green, this luscious, fertile colour. It's often said of, as I say, healthy plants, but also of the sea, this kind of blue-green colour. Similarly, we have ruag, which we can't describe in a single English word really. So what I've chosen here is rusty red. So it's this kind of, what we can say, ginger, sort of red-headed colour, ruag. Now we have a word for this in Gaelic because this colour is so prominent in Gaelic Scotland and Gaelic Ireland. So it's so prominent out in the hills, obviously, we're looking at the bracken, looking at a lot of the foliage that we have. But of course as well, in these parts of the British Isles, we have much higher percentages of red-headed people. And if you say red-headed or ginger, if you think about those two colours, like a ginger root, that does not in any way accurately describe someone with red hair. It just doesn't, it's not the same colour. So that's where this word Gaelic, this Gaelic word, ruag, comes in. So we break up the spectrum slightly differently. Riavach, there's a farm on the back road when you get to the junction, to go left to Connaught or right to Kilmore. Ochriach farm, the brindled farm. So brindled is this strange, again, kind of patchwork colour of streaky red and black and brown. So you sometimes see Highland cattle with that colour. This is not a great picture, but I'm sure you'll have seen it before, where it's not a ruag cow, not a black cow, not a blonde one. It's this strange mix. And it's often said of the devil is described as being brindled, being riavach in Gaelic. So it's generally not a great omen if your cattle, if your cow is born and it is that colour. Some people prize it. I'm not sure if the old Gaels would have done. But riavach, so it's not a colour, it's almost a mix of colours. Finally, Leah, I'm glad to see we're getting out of these kind of days, but Leah, is this word that just describes a crisp Highland winter day. So there is this covering of snow, it is slightly overcast, it's not white or grey, you can't see blue sky. If you look at your scene in front of you, it is Leah. There's a novel that came out a couple of years ago, an Irish novel called The Geometer Libachowski, and they describe in that the kind of the Irish colour palette can all be defined to two different colours, which are dun and tan. So dun is this brown colour, tan colour. So essentially every colour that you can see, you can split it in two and they all go down to this. And I think we can kind of say the same for the Scottish Gaelic colour system. We can say that for Leah as well. That fits into one of them. See that? Dun or tan. So I won't go through all the colours there. A lot of them are fairly self-explanatory. Here's the grammar bit. I will do my best to get through this and not put anyone to sleep. But this is really useful. If I had picked this up when I was learning Gaelic, it would have been a real lifesaver for a lot of the grammar. So I'm sure a lot of people here like to pore over OS maps of an evening, and you're trying to decipher them, and then you come along these little pesky little words in the middle that are kind of really confusing to an English-speaking eye. So that's these little words in the middle here. So if we've seen, I'm trying to think of an example. I'm going to look at this one next. Achnalarig, the stables. There's two words there, achig and larig. And then there's this annoying little word that doesn't have a meaning. You can't find it in the dictionary in the middle, which is n. What I can tell you is that n and nha and and inte and in, these annoying little particles that we come across, all of them just mean off the or off. So it's just a joining, a genitive particle in the middle. What that looks like in practice is this. So again, I've got a screenshot of that up at Archaeological. So you can see this little hill here beside the railway line. Meow and Tagerst. I did meow earlier, means a lump. So meow and Tagerst. Meow, lump, unte, off the. That's all you have to know, off the. Sagerst, priest. Lump, off the priest. So all that little unte is doing is it's saying off there. And getting that in our head for deciphering Gaelic is really useful. Can also mean off, but either way you'll get a rough idea of what it means. Just below that, as I say, achnalarig, achig, n. N just happens to be the word that's in there. Why? We don't need to get into it. There's grammar that explains it, but there's no need for that for deciphering place names. And larig is another word for a pass. So field off the pass. Does that concept kind of make sense? No. Okay. Because I wish that was explained to you when I was learning Gaelic. No. So before I go into more of the kind of lighter stuff, I thought I'd do a little bit of explanation how you can actually go and find out some of this stuff. And I can probably share this presentation as well with Jill. We can circulate this to people if you can't take note of it. But this is a dictionary that I really recommend for a few reasons, an online dictionary. It has problems, there's no online dictionary that's totally perfect. But this one is great for deciphering place names because it also contains Dwelly's Gaelic dictionary. If anyone's familiar with Dwelly's, it was published about 100 years ago. I think Dwelly was a Welshman or an Englishman who went around and picked up all of these words that relate to traditional practices that we maybe aren't familiar with anymore. So this dictionary also contains that as well as a modern dictionary. So words that are in place names might not be in common practice anymore, common use anymore, but we'll find them with Dwelly's. So fachler.com, which means dictionary.com, you can put it into English. I usually use it in Gaelic, but this is it in English. And we've got a search field here, which you can put absolutely anything in. What are you going to put in? So here we are, we're looking at a map. This is just past Dunstafnage Castle. Now I know that Camas is a bay. You can see the bay. Rua, I can tell you, Ru is a point, another word for promontory. Na, it's just telling you it means off the. So it's the bay off the point off the, and then I get stumped because I don't recognise this word, which is a situation you might find yourself in after this if you go back to look at your maps. So we take the word, liahik, that's how it's written here, liahik, and we're going to put it into the dictionary and hit search. Now I've put it in exactly as it appeared on the map. I've changed absolutely nothing about it. What this dictionary does is this shows you the word, if it has it in it, and it also puts it back into its base case. So we have different cases in Gaelic that can be a real
really confusing for folk that are learning a language for the first time. This can make it a little bit easier to use because it doesn't matter what case you put in it will still give you it. Now give me 4 results actually, I've just shown you 3. Now I'm looking at the 2 of these, and I think, looking at the 2 of them, the second one looks a little bit closer to what I was looking at. Because rather than an O, it's got an A there. I can confirm to myself that it's correct by looking at this little bit here, which tells me that's what it looks like in the genitive case. It was the genitive case that I put in. So Leike, which is the word I was looking for here, is not a very useful word on the dictionary. Unspecific term for a grey object, animal, being, or plant, which really doesn't help much. It says here grilse and par, which I am assuming are types of fish. I don't know much about that. Yep. So that's told me already. I've worked out now what that final word is, and I didn't have to know any of the grammar. I just put it in exactly as it appeared on the map. I've got another example. No, I don't actually have another example of that. But you can do the same looking at any map. Just by chance, the map that I've chosen was the same one that I think someone had put on the event. I don't know why we chose this, but I think it's maybe because it's a really interesting one. This is not a very well explored bit, although it's only a few kilometres south of us here in Oban, down past Lerags and Minard Point and the bottom of Kerala. But just look at all of these words here. We might have looked at that, we might have looked at my Irish charts if you're a sailor or what have you, and just seen a pile of scribbles. Hopefully after this, what you're seeing is there is so much information there that has not been uncovered. No one's really bothered. Gaelic speakers, we might look at it and say, oh yeah, that means that. But for us, maybe if we don't speak Gaelic, if we're just really interested in this, you now have the tools using things like Fachler and using other resources to work some of these out. So I recommend tonight everyone just get your OS maps out and pour over them and just look at the wealth of information you have here that tells you about all these things. That was the thing I was going to say. Basically, when we learn about place names, the first thing people want to do is they want to go, oh, what does Oban mean? What does Tynell mean? What does Clonmel mean? Which is what I do. The real wealth, I think, is figuring out what all these tiny little things tell us so much about our environment, about the people, the land, and the place, and the language. So, a few examples of interest. Anyone recognise either of these guys? It could be from any point over 500 years in Archaeological. First one here is King William, King Billy. So that's him there, everyone can recognise him, wearing his orange. So we've got Fort William, which we've all seen on the Gaelic signs, is in Geddeston. Geddeston is a loan word, it's a word that's been borrowed from English, from the word garrison. So it means in Geddeston, the garrison, or the fort. So in English it's described as Fort William, William's Fort, King William's Fort. In Gaelic, just described as the fort. That tells us already so much about the general political allegiances of the different speakers. So, I mean, it's funny to look at it in retrospect, but it's so telling of how the language split. Now, there were 100% Gaelic speakers on both sides, essentially, of the conflicts happening based out of Fort William. But it's really interesting to us that the predominant Catholic and, say, rebellion-supporting Gaelic-speaking people in Lochaber and the West Highlands refer to this as the fort. Those generally English speakers, more supporting of the monarchy, described it as Fort William. So although we just see it on the sign as Fort William in Geddeston, that is demonstrative of hundreds and hundreds of years of social, political and religious conflict in this part of the world. So it's so much value in that. Same, this guy here, the 3rd Earl of Argyll, one of the many Archibald Campbells. This is Campbelltown, as we know it in English. In Gaelic, it is Camloch Hillihiarin, which takes up like 3 metres of signage. But because it's a lovely name, Camloch Hillihiarin, the head of the Loch of Kieran's church. So Killia, or Kill, when we see that, like Kilmore, Kilcrennan, Kilmarnock. Kill is a traditional small church or cell belonging to a saint. So that's what Campbelltown was called before this man, the 3rd Earl of Argyll, marched down, decided he quite liked it, and said, this is Campbelltown, that's just how it is now. So we still see that in Gaelic, Camloch Hillihiarin. Again, related to political beliefs and religious beliefs. This one can be a little bit confusing, so bear with me. Some of you might have heard this from me before, and you still might not be able to follow it, but it's interesting. So we're looking at a map here of Banal and Tynell. Is anyone here from Bunau? Anyone live out in Bunau? Yeah, we've got one. So, has anyone thought at all why on earth Bunau is called Bunau? Or is that just people like me? Think for that? Jamie, eyes. Right, do you want to explain it up? No, that's okay. Yeah, so Bunau, the word we can see in there, aw, relates to Loch, river aw. But Bunau, essentially, if we look at it today, has absolutely no doings with the river aw, no relation to it whatsoever. Less than a kilometre away, but other than that, doesn't rely on it in any way. Now, what did rely on it was, of course, this village here, labelled as Buckroy, and where Bunau iron furnace is. So back before the railway came to this part of the world, these were essentially one village, Bunau. That was the one village, that's what it was known as, and they were down on the shores here. So connected here, that's about 200 metres there, that's really nothing to a seafaring people, it was much easier to move by water than by land. So Bunau and Tinault were one village. When the train line came along, in the middle of the 1800s, the village, quite understandably, moved about a kilometre south, and it centred itself around the station and the hotel. So Tinault, some people might have seen on the signs, Tai in Ulch, Tai house in off the Ulch stream, house of the stream. So the house in question in Tinault is the hotel. It's unfortunately in a bit of a sorry state just now. But Tinault gained the name Tinault when Tinault Hotel was built. Tinault Hotel was built for the railway. So the village essentially moved away from the shore of Loch Etive and left poor Bunau disconnected, unimportant, left as a backwater, but left it with the original name of Bunau, even though it's entirely disconnected. A way to think about this is quite interesting, is thinking about the fact that the way we think about road systems in Scotland today dictates a lot of the way that we think about things. To a lot of people, Glen Etive is the far, far end of the world, because you've got to go all the way up to Glencoe and then all the way down to the top of Glen Etive. Back in the day, that wouldn't have been too far by boat. Those two communities would have been really, really connected. So road systems play with us a little bit. This particular road, though, is the B845. And the ultimate local Kilcrennan trivia question is, what two villages are at the end of the B845? The answer is Barcaldine and Delavich, because this is the same road, because there was this historical connection between the two villages. It's now entirely severed, but the road numbers are still the same. So if you're looking at a pub quiz in Kilcrennan, just wait for that. There we go. So I think this is maybe one of the final ones. Tarbert, anyone know what Tarbert means at all? Is that a common one? Yeah,
narrowing of land between two bodies of water.
Yeah, spot on. So yeah, the official word is an isthmus, or we might know it as a portage. So some way, essentially, if you really had to, you could pull a boat across to get to the next bit of water. So we have that in Paris, have that in Jura, have that in Kintyre, and have that in Loch Lomond. And there's a couple up here as well. But it comes from two Gaelic words, tar and biarsht. Tar, meaning across, tarsing, across, and biarsht, the word for any large contraption. So usually we use it to mean a loom today, like a weaving loom, but biarsht is any large contraption. So tar biarsht, anywhere you can pull a large contraption across. And that was really important actually during the Viking settlement of the west coast. A guy called Magnus Bearleg, a Viking. Has anyone heard about him? Yeah. So he was the first guy. He was wearing this weird thing called a kjalta that he brought from Norway. That Scots then decided was quite fancy and decided to adopt and call a kilt. Hence Magnus Bearleg. So that's another foreign import to Scotland as the kilt. But he made a deal with, I'm not sure who was ruling at the time, but he said any island he could sail around then belonged to the Viking Magnus Bearleg. So he sailed around all these islands, Islay, Jura, and Mull, and Arran, and Gia. And he got up to Tarbert, Loch Fyne, and said, yeah, I'll have that too. And he got his team out of the boat and pulled it across from West Loch to East Loch Tarbert and claimed Kintyre as an island. It's quite fun. Right, another challenge for the mountaineers. In Monagshee, Mountains of Peace, whereabouts are these? Gaelic means sky, looks like sky. Anyone else? Could be, yeah. Looks a lot of sky, we're actually sharp next there. You're a wee bit far out. It's in British Columbia. Close, only 4,000 miles. But yeah, these are the Menashe Mountains, as they call it in Canada. And that comes from Gaelic, along with thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of other place names. I was just looking at that before I came. I highly recommend reading two books, A Dance Called America and Glencoe and the Indians by James Hunter. Really great illustrations of how Scots moved over to the New World. And essentially what we did there, which was the exact same as what was happening here in Scotland at the same time. We like to forget about what happens after the cleared Highlanders get on the boats. They get on the boats, land in the New World, and do the exact same thing on an even larger scale to the indigenous people in North America. It's worth remembering that. That's where all of these Scottish and Gaelic names come from in Canada.
So what was the name?
It's a good question. I'm not sure at all. So the people, the first peoples that live here are the Kootenai. I think the Scots colonists that went over there weren't as interested in place names as I was, so they didn't exactly go and ask what it is. They were more interested in getting rid of them, which is something really worth remembering when we talk about things like Highland clearances and the discrimination that Highlanders faced. It didn't end when we left the West Coast. It continued. So forensic place name study. Calling it forensic is I'm playing fast and loose with the term. You're not going to get a job in crime organisation, but you can work out so much about a place from the Gaelic name. So does anyone know what Lismore or Lismore means? The big garden, the great garden. Yeah. The reason for that, well, it's renowned for being so fertile. You can see it there. Beautiful green, lovely for growing things. Lots of stories about Newsdale Lighthouse, all the amazing things they grew in the gardens there. But that comes because of the Great Glen Fault. So 300 million years ago, there was a mountain building event called the Caledonian Orogeny, and when these two big massive tectonic plates rubbed together, they created the Great Glen. And during all of this disturbance, this big lump of calcium rose up out of the fault, and that is what Lismore is. So it's really high in limestone and calcium, which is, again, I don't know much about gardening, fantastic apparently for growing crops and for grazing animals. So that's why Lismore is so renowned. So the name itself tells us about the geology of the place. Yeah, before I pass back to yourselves a bit to open it up, I thought we'd look a little bit at some of the work that the Brigadier John MacFarlane produced. So this is an extract from one of his many papers in the journals. This one was published in 2010, talking about some of the hydronyms in MacAirean, so place names relating to water, which quite often are our oldest place names because they represented the first boundaries that needed to be named and remembered. So water are quite often the oldest names. We talked about the word bile, which is also mentioned by Meg Bateman in Saul and the Grave, the image of the tree. It's this idea of a votive tree, a really, really sacred tree as a gateway to the other world. Ian MacNeish, the renowned Gaelic scholar, also talks about this. According to the Gaels' old pagan beliefs, there were doors in the land, fairy hillocks and wells that were thresholds between two worlds. There were also copses in which they would praise the gods and goddesses and the other powers in which the pagans believed. Bile is the name that was given to this type of tree, a sacred tree. Now, I don't know if anyone spent any time on this side of Benlora, but it's not a particularly well visited site. It's very, very steep and muddy and not too much on it, apart from these two things here. Crev Biel na Buai and Tope Biel na Buai. So the well of the votive tree, the votive tree of victory and the votive well. Votive is just this idea of sacred, something important. And as Ian MacNeish is saying, this idea of it being a gateway to the other world. If anyone's seen Stranger Things, think about that. It's this idea of there being an upside down, another world, the world of the Danishi, the fairy folk. Now, that's interesting in itself, and it tells us, just looking at the Gaelic place name, I can look at that and say, well, there's a place that no one's been for a good little while, I'll bet, but it's got some of the most amazing, significant sacred sites, pre-Christian sites in Gaelic Scotland. That's pretty cool. What makes it more interesting, however, is not marked on the map, is this site here. A few metres to the south of the votive well and tree are the remains of a small graveyard. The burial ground is said to have been used for the interment of unbaptised children and was last used about 1830. So that tells us that these sites did not just remain pre-Christian. They did not go out of use, they did not stop being important when Christianity swept through this part of Gaelic, 500, 600, 700 AD. In fact, They continued to be used until at least 1830, with the idea of an unbaptized, a non-Christian child that had unfortunately passed away, being laid to rest right beside this gateway to the pre-Celtic Gaelic otherworld. As recent as 1830. And there are so many examples of this, even in places like Lewis, which we consider to be hugely important in modern day Scottish Christianity. That's a fairly recent invention. Up to around about 1900, there's still so many so many pagan practices still being practiced on the island, which is absolutely amazing. So yeah, it's just the idea that looking through place names at this unvisited, generally unvisited part of Benbara and part of Argyll, we can find so much about the people that used to live here. Carmarthenshire, your turn. So hopefully that wasn't too long. It was okay. But what I'd like to do is basically open up any questions relating to anything we've seen there, or if you're just like, my house is called this, what does it mean? Please go for it. I'll try and work it out. All these things you should caveat a little bit of conjecture. Can't be sure of absolutely everything. But what we can do is potentially we can go into Google and work out some of these things using the dictionary. So yeah, I'd like to invite, does anyone have any questions? Yes. Yeah, please.
Thanks. This is a bit odd. It's about rum, the Isle of Rum.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, it was the first time I went to Scotland actually, to the Gaelic. I happened to be married to a Norwegian, and I also happened to have been a sailor.
Right.
And when I look at the map of the OS map of Rum, I'm going to blast out Gaelic. It's all Ordnance Survey Gaelic, you know.
Yeah.
But when I look at it, all the hills that you can see from the sea, Alival, Askewal, Trollvall, Anshval, Orval, and Val means fjella, which means hill in a mountain. There are lots of Gaelic names of features as well. But all of those ones with fjella at the end, and Trollfjell in particular, which frightened the Vikings because of the birds, you know. But you can see them from the sea. You can use them as landmarks, you see.
Yeah, navigational points.
It was most peculiar, and I just wondered if this rang a bell with anybody else, and whether it's true anywhere else, because you've got an overlap there, Norse, and your map shows it beautifully, Norse and Gaelic, and Rum seems to me to be a classic case, you know.
Right in the middle.
Yeah, but I wondered if it was true of anywhere else.
Yeah, so essentially.
Can you repeat the short part of the question so that
so
everybody
the
else
question basically about the Isle of Rum in particular, all of the hills there end in Val, which is a Norse element. Think about Fjallraven, the fancy trendy fashion outwear place. So Fjall, yeah, there we go. So Fjall or Fell, the English fells, which is what the Danes mean. It's this Norse word for bine or ben as we know it. So that's a great example of where Gaelic and Norse meet. You're asking other examples, hundreds. So I mean, all of the hills to the Western Isles, Aval, Hayval, Nyallaval, Suinyaval, all of these. So Val is a best example. We can see it through things like Vat. Vatur is the modern Scandinavian word for water. We have Loch Langavat. We have all of these Vat, things like that. So it's really common, and particularly the best preserved in the Western Isles. And what's been really interesting with the Western Isles is that they've come as being Norse, but then with the return, essentially, the surge of Gaelic communities there, they've stuck with the Norse name, but they've put it back into Gaelic orthography that we recognise. So like Callanish, not spelled the English way, C-A-L-A-N-A-I-S, Callanish. Both of those are originally Norse elements that have been put back into Gaelic. So that's where the real kind of forensic work comes in looking at them. Right, I recognise those as Norse words. I need to take them out of Gaelic, back into Norse, and back into English. But it's most common down also the western seaboard, as you can see. But there's a book that I'll recommend at the end, Cap Jarman, The River Kings, which is kind of a new study of the Vikings as we saw them in Scotland as these coastal raiders. That was just the tip of the iceberg. The biggest Viking settlement in the British Isles is in Derby, which is about as far inland as you can get. So it's the idea that Vikings had this really shallow wherewings. They could get all the way up the rivers of Britain. And if actually they went through all the rivers of Central Europe and got through as far as Asia, essentially. So, lost my train of thought there. But what I was saying is that although they're mostly on the coast here, because Gaelic was then essentially preserved in the centre of the country, we can find Norse elements throughout the entire.
Can you tell me what the book was again?
That's Cap Jarman, The River Kings. I've got it on the end as well. Really worth looking at. Yes?
Longsdale here in Oban, that's a Scandi word.
Yeah.
It's the valley of the longship. So
Yeah, spot on. So Longsdal is maybe how we say it in Norse or Gaelic. So Long, L-O-N-G, is the Gaelic word we have for a Norse ship. The Gaelic word we have for a big, massive ship, like a Berlin. So Longsdal, and Dal is again the Norse word for a glen, the Yorkshire Dales. We have Glendale and Skye, which is tautology, Glen. But Longsdal, and we know that in modern Scandinavia, to show possession, we do the same thing as we do in English, which is, this is, so Ross's laptop, so they do Longsdal. So it's the glen pertaining to the longship. Same with Loch Long by Archaeological, Loch Long, the loch of the big Berlin, the big deep ships, which is quite interesting today, thinking about the really big ships that they have in Loch Long, which is very interesting. Yeah. Yes?
Just sort of following on from that, Alistair White, Dr. Alistair White, man in the Mull, and he writes, he's a Gaelic scholar, and he writes a super column every month for the local paper around White. And one of the recent one that he did was on the place name, it's all about place names on Mull. And the recent one was the Scalston on Mull, and he reckoned that it was quite a complicated combination of things, but he reckoned that the name was taken from the hills behind. It's a behind place. It's a farm, a very fertile farm on the Sound of Mull side of the island. So referring back to the shape of the hills, which were kind of bowl shaped.
Right.
Just trying to remember this, but I wondered, reading the column, whether it was hesitant to challenge it because he's so knowledgeable, but in the Norse, scale is refers to a hall for quite an important building in
Right.
There's quite a lot of places in Northern using scale, and I just thought, oh gosh, because it is a fertile area. It's quite an important farm. Could it actually Scalston actually maybe reference that?
Yeah, I think so. So I don't know about that exact place, and I don't know Scala, but the idea that the place name gives us a really. I should clarify. The question was about Scalstall in Mull, just kind of past Clonmere. There's been a definition given, a definition given which means kind of bowl-shaped hills with a farm beside or glen, which would make sense. You're asking potentially something relating to something else, would particularly to do with Norse settlement. So the place name gives us the first indication. I think, without knowing anything about any of the words, you would then go to the archaeology to then back yourself up and say, I got it. But I don't know about those exact ones. But particularly, I would like to see that from Dr. Alistair. That sounds interesting. But I don't know myself about it. Yeah, it's Alistair. Yes?
I'm originally from Easter Ross. I guess my original interest in Gaelic was a bit like the subject of this lecture. It was, I felt illiterate in my own landscape. And I recall going to, I was studying at Oban Academy and asking, why can't I learn Gaelic? And at that time, that was sort of mid to late 70s. So no academic value at all was what we were talking. But the village I was from is called Inaugural, which is between in Portmahon, and it was one of the last Gaelic-speaking villages in the east. And thankfully, we took some recordings of the last Gaelic speakers in the village. I get lots and lots of questions. I think for this one, we've talked about on the west how there's a link between Norse and Gaelic, and obviously there's a merger of the culture of the Norse Gael, lordship of the Isles, for what we're doing. But the side of the East Gaelic was different in some ways to the West Gaelic, and so many of the farms and villages like Pitthorgarty, Pitmaduthi, there's the Abers, and I wondered whether, even though Pictish never acquired a written language as we understood it, was it still part of the language and part of the place name, and I also wonder part of the dialect, and for someone with far greater knowledge than you, if you look at the place names where there's maybe a merger of Pictish and Gaelic, can you detect the differences from the West?
Yeah, so that's one of the few. So the question was about the area that was challenged from is Easter Ross and around about kind of the corner of the Murray Firth there. Question about where there's a couple of questions, I'll come back to the Easter Ross as well. But where Pictish kind of maybe Pictish question mark merges with Gaelic, whether that happened. 100% as far as we know that did happen, and one of the few indicators we do have about a Pictish language that tells us what it might have been, it probably was Celtic, are these words Pit and Aber that you named, and there's a couple other. But Pit, you see that in Pit and Weem, Pitawdry, the pits that you mentioned up there, Pitcreef, then Aber, Aberlemno down in Angus, Aberdeen, Aberarder, Aberlour, and there's an Aber way down south, Aberystwyth. That tells us that yes, at one point there was the shared P-Celtic language, so when the languages split, that's what Pictish probably spoke. So the Celtic languages that are now spoken in Wales, Cornwall and Brittany were probably the same Brythonic that stretched all the way up the east coast as well. And they did eventually merge with Gaelic, particularly in that area. Talking about East Sutherland Gaelic though, East Sutherland Gaelic, which is the kind of area you're roughly in, that was renowned in the area for being so distinctly different. If I remember correctly from uni, and I'm looking at some people who probably did the same class as me that might remember, the East Sutherland Gaelic was significantly influenced by Travellers' Cant. So Travellers' Cant comes from the Gaelic trench, so the travellers speak, the travellers' speech. So it's influenced by that. Also influenced by further south East Coast fisher folk coming up and influencing them with Scots and Doric. So East Sutherland Gaelic was really different, and then mixing with the Norse from above in places like Caithness. So it was really different, and I recommend two people that you should speak to or look at. So the late Nancy Dorian was a professor that looked at East Sutherland Gaelic and dialects. She was the absolute undying expert on that, really, really worth looking at. And then there's a younger guy, Rudy Moore McLennan, who's an architect in Inverness, who is now the expert on Easter Ross Gaelic. Worth getting in touch with him if you can and find out a little bit more, because he knows more than anyone else. Back at the back.
Hello, can you give me a reference for the history? I know it's difficult to do the whole history, but the history of Gaelic folk songs.
History of Gaelic folk songs. Not 100% my area of expertise. I think there probably are people in this room that are. I can't name anything off the top of my
There's
head.
a whole website on Oban and Dulfish.
Yeah, it's a great point.
It
So,
has a fabulous collection of recordings and songs and often lyrics as well.
so yeah, Topper and Dulachish, or Kesto Riches. So that's Gaelic and Scots, huge database of recordings. But there are also loads of books. Off the top of my head, I can't think, but the Gaelic Books Council is worth speaking to. They will have huge amounts. And the lady in front of you as well is a wealth of knowledge. I'm realising. I think I'll two more questions if that's all right. The back.
Thanks, Ross, for that fascinating journey this afternoon. Yesterday afternoon, I was climbing the hill trying to catch a blackface shell in the back road to Cornwall. Without success.
Did you win?
I stayed in a place called Archaeological, so it's High Cornwall. My interest is the legacy of place names in the crofting community, you go to Dalmally and Oban auction marts, the sale days, 75% plus of the crofts and farms are Gaelic names or Gaelic names with a slight English intrusion, maybe that's influenced the layers in some of the places. You go for a north, for like Archaeological or Tree and Sky, it's nearly 100%. Is there an unresearched tapestry in there about the history of these places and the name links to the Gaelic language? There's so many of them, the names are hung on, despite the challenges on the land at the moment, people getting forced out, and the names have largely hung on and stayed. Is there stuff there that we can look at to get more background on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the question was asked there about the links potentially between traditional crofting communities and farming communities, which have been subjugated against due to a lot of the historic pressure of the past 400 years in Gaelic Scotland, and whether there are resources for that. Again, off the top of my head, not 100%, but I would direct you always towards James Hunter, the Highland historian, who's written a lot about the crofting community. Directly relating to place names, I'm again not 100% sure. There's something I was going to say on that, I can't remember. Yeah, about the way the place names were recorded. When General William Roy, British Army General, essentially in 1734 or so, established the Ordnance Survey. Ordnance means stuff to blow things up, and the people they were aiming on blowing up were Highlanders generally. So the map was a military map. So they wanted to map out Scotland as best as possible, but they wanted to do it properly, and that's why the Ordnance Survey is the best map in the world. Essentially, no country compares to it. They didn't just go off of High-Heatian lairds for names. They had an order of hierarchy. The easiest people to contact were obviously people like lairds. Below that, ministers. And ministers obviously were incredibly loyal to their local community, and so they knew it inside and out. So they would give properly accurate croft names and things like that to people. Below that, there was an order. I can't remember the order of hierarchy they had, but it was surprisingly research focused, kind of really useful for us that you would expect for what was essentially a military map. It was really well done. Reading Map Addict by, I think his name is Rich Parker. Map Addict talks about that. It might not be Rich Parker, but the book Map Addict goes into that.
And yes, and you can reference the Ordnance Survey books on Scotland's places online.
Yeah.
And so it's well worth looking there for anything as well. If you have got places that you know of that are not on Scotland's places, record them, because you are the person. Just like John was, and John's mother was before, you're the person that needs to be recording them now. And we're the same, there's a lot of stuff that hasn't been recorded, and the memory is in people you know, and people where you are walking and where you know somebody. It's anything you hear, record it, because that's how things are lost, because we assume somebody else has. And unlike, in McCain, they're lucky. They had John's mum and then John afterwards. Most of us haven't had that, so a huge amount of information has been lost.
Yeah.
There is what is on the Ordnance Survey, but there's probably a lot of local things that you can pick up. You're the recorder.
Yeah. I'll come to Eleanor in a minute for the final question, if that's all right. But on that point, a book recommendation I've got at the end is a recently published book, The Bone Cave by Dougie Strang, who I think just moved locally. And it refers to the carrying stream of folklore. So it's this idea that everything I've showed you here is not concrete. It's all evolved over thousands of years, and it is currently evolving. With us talking about it now, someone in this room will have misinterpreted or misheard me describing something, and you'll go and tell your kids, and they'll tell your kids, and that's okay, because that's how the carrying stream of folklore works. It's just kind of been a little bit concreted by things like the Ordnance Survey, which are great in the Gaelic redevelopment works, but the carrying stream is a great concept for looking at Gaelic folklore. People are often determined to put down the history, the way it happened. Every family and every person has an entirely different interpretation of it, and that's okay. That's how folklore and oral history survives. So The Bone Cave by Dougie Strang talks about that. Final question from Eleanor, and then I'll be hanging around as well for lots of questions. I'll be keen to chat to folk.
It's not a question, it's a follow-on to Alison.
Ah, great.
Farming connections. I've just recently found that my home farm is Enian in the old Sanskrit record, so it's spelled slightly different but described exactly as the farm. And I think Jill has got quite a lot on the Pattern Wikidot, which Brigadier MacFarlane worked on, and I was confident enough, as having lived in Enian, to disagree with what his description was. The family connection, it says that when you look from the hill onto the top fields, it's the shape of an angle, and that's where it came from.
Yeah.
It's a slightly different description in the Gaelic. But the Assassin's Book of Ulster is another one.
Yeah. But that's a great point. That picks up on the kind of thing I was saying, that people always do have these separate things. Glen Salloch's a great one. The background people say Dirty Glen or Willow Glen. It doesn't matter, both of them are fun, and it means we're talking about place names, so it means you then talk about the ones next to it, and that's brilliant. But around that area it's really interesting as well. Lots of stuff that Dr. Alistair has looked at as well. So yeah, these are a few of the books I was talking about. Edward Dwelly's Illustrated Gaelic English Dictionary wasn't published in 2011, this is just the new one. Ian Taylor's Place Names of Scotland. Everyone get a copy of this and put it in the dashboard of your car for when you're driving around Scotland. Brilliant book. And then finally, John Murray's Reading the Gaelic Landscape, particularly if you're a hill walker, you work outside. It's brilliant. It talks about the different heights of hills and how they're named. It goes really in depth into that. So those are 3 books I highly recommend. And of course, the journals of the Lorn Archaeological and Historical Society. Not just pushing them for the sake of it, but really, particularly your MacFarlane's work that's in there. It's absolutely brilliant, and you get lost in it for hours on end. So really great. That is it from me. Thank you very much. As you can see, I've got references up here and we're recommended reading. And yeah, I'm trying my entrepreneurial hand. If you are interested in beginning to decipher some of these, I've produced a deck of flashcards that have all of these elements that we've looked at and more, 64 cards in it, that will hopefully, if you're going out on the hill, going out for a dog walk and you see a name, you look up in the cards and find it. But yeah, thank you very much everyone for coming along and listening to this. It's been great to have the questions, and as I say, I'll be hanging around. In particular, it was very nice to be joined by the late Brigadier MacFarlane's widow, Val. Very nice to be speaking in front of you and hopefully contributing to the Brigadier's legacy here. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Society, a final token of our gratitude. Thank you, Ross.